All right, so we're going to start with basic principles. And the very first one we want to talk about is a big one, filling the frame. This is huge, and it's something that doesn't often come naturally to everyone. So here's an example. This was taken with my phone while I was on the sofa crocheting something, and I looked up and I saw my cat over there, and she was just so sweet on the chair, and I thought, oh, let's get a picture. Now this is just a snapshot. This is what happens when you're engrossed in something else and not really willing to put in the effort to get up and get the shot that I think I really should have gotten. So when we look at this photo, I look at it and I'm like, what's the subject? Is it my cat? Is it the piece of crochet that I'm working on? Is it my wrinkled pants in the bottom corner? I don't really know. It's a kind of a mess. So clearly that's not the best composition choice there. If you're leaving your viewers wondering what they're really supposed to be looking at, then that's a sign that you probably missed the mark a little bit. So I realized that, and then I thought, okay, I'll get up, put my crochet aside. So I did, and then I was able to get a much better, more interesting photo by getting much closer and filling the frame with only the things that I wanted to have. So instead of just shooting from where I was, I got up and actually actively composed the shot, and it turned out much more powerfully. So another example, here's another shot of a friend of mine's daughter, and they were making cupcakes one morning, and the first one here is just what I would consider a snapshot. If we think about the difference sometimes between a snapshot and a photograph, I really just think the difference is mindfulness and being aware of what you're doing. A snapshot to me is something done really without a lot of thought. It's just a quick, ooh, that looks fun, and you just grab it. You're not thinking about the story you're telling or how to make that photo the most interesting. It's just a grab. So this picture is a grab. She's centered in the frame, which is not really interesting. There's also, we can see one of her parents off to the side. We see a trash can in the background. We see the oven open. I mean, just kind of a lot of random stuff around the scene. If I just bring a little bit of mindfulness and fill the frame with my subject and the story I want to tell, I can get a much more compelling shot like this one. So that's filling the frame. The next principle we're going to talk about is called the rule of thirds. And you can't really study photography for more than probably 5 minutes without running into the rule of thirds somewhere. So basically, the rule of thirds just says that it's much more interesting if you can put your subjects, instead of always putting them in the center of the frame, the idea is you want to put them in one of the thirds. So if you've ever looked through your viewfinder and seen this, it looks like a grid. And if it's not appearing through your viewfinder by default, you could play around with your camera and check your display settings, because it's usually an option that you can turn on if you want it. So the idea is that if you divide the frame into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, then the points of interest are where the lines intersect. So we can see in this image that I put little circles in all those corners. And the idea is that if you put your subject somewhere where those lines intersect, your photo will be more interesting. So here's an example of not using the rule of thirds. So here, this subject is just centered in the middle of the frame. And it's not terrible. I mean, it's filling the frame. There's not a lot of distracting background elements. So that's nice. But it doesn't have a lot of balance. It's just centered right in what we would sometimes call the dead center of the frame. And it gets that name because it's just pretty boring. It doesn't add a lot of dynamic interest or movement to the scene. So here is the scene recomposed with our subject over on the right third. And I think it's just a lot more interesting. It also creates some negative space, which we'll talk about in a minute. Here's another example. Beautiful picture, beautiful subject matter, beautiful colors, everything is great, but again, the subject's just dead center, and it's just not terribly interesting. Here's the same scene recomposed. Now it's vertical, so it was horizontal, but here's a vertical composition. with that flower in the upper right third, and suddenly it's just a lot cleaner. One more example of my son here. Again, dead center. Kids are hard. Man, they move a lot, so it's really hard to have your composition set with them. One trick that I use as often as I can with him is to put him in a chair so he can't get away. Here he is eating lunch, and I've got him in the center of the frame, but that's obviously not the most interesting photo. Here I've recomposed the scene, and he was playing around and laughing, and I caught this great moment where he's just thrown his head back in laughter, and it's more interesting for a lot of reasons, but also because he's in the right third. Here's another image of just a still life, eucalyptus leaves, and again in the center of the frame. And we have this beautiful wall color. Our house is really colorful at home, so I use it a lot for backgrounds when I'm shooting things. But in this example here, I have it centered in the frame, and we see the patio door to the left, which lets in a lot of excellent light. So that's really nice, but it's just kind of random that it's on the side there like that. So here's the same scene shot from a slightly different position and moving the plant over to the left. So it adds more interest. We can see the mirror on the right, and it's a nicer composition. Just a couple more examples with the overlay so you can see vertical or horizontal. Another portrait. Now, when you use the rule of thirds, it's not to say that you can never put your subject in the center. I mean, rules are meant to be broken, obviously, but it helps to understand the rules so you can break them with knowledge and break them purposefully and intentionally with a reason. So here is an image where the subjects are in the center of the frame, but there's some other compositional things that we haven't talked about yet that are happening in this image that help really support it, even though I put the subjects in the center. So one thing is that this image has leading lines, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also the horizon is down close to the lower third. So that also helps. So even though the people themselves are in the center, the horizon is in the lower third. Here's another example. Again, the subjects are centered. But another compositional element that's in this photo that we haven't talked about yet is some natural framing that's happening. So they're in the center, but then they have these trees circling around them that helps to frame them, and that adds to the composition as well. Another image with the subject in the center, that can also be done really well, I think, if it's very symmetrical. So in this case, we have these bold blue shoes and then the geometric pattern of the sofa. So it works in this case to hold that in the center because it is so symmetrical. A fireworks image, again, they're in the center, but it works out nicely in this case. Again, done intentionally. And my cat. What would an example be without the cat? But here she is centered as well. But again, the image is very symmetrical. Same here. And here as well, again with leading lines. So the rule of thirds tells you to put your subject in one of those points where the lines intersect in the top or bottom or left or right third of the frame. But remember, you can always break those rules. Just make sure you know why you're doing it. All right, next up, as a basic principle, we have repetition. So when you repeat things in photos, you can repeat lots of different things. You can repeat shapes. So here I have a picture of that eucalyptus plant, and the leaves create a repeating pattern. In this image, it's some Roman columns that form a line, so that's interesting, and they repeat also. So repeating patterns can be interesting. Shapes, here we have repeating circles, and the colors, although they're not the same, they're sort of along the same, in the same vein. Repeating lines can find a lot in nature. Nature provides ample opportunity to capture patterns, as well as architecture. This is shot upwards, looking upwards from a stairwell, basically, in a hotel building in Santa Fe. This is just the pattern, the upholstery pattern on a chair somewhere. I forget where that was. Some hotel someplace. One thing that can be interesting when you're photographing patterns is that you can also interrupt and break the pattern. So here's an example of my son. I fell in love with this rug when I was putting his room together. I like geometric imagery. And so I found this rug with all these stripes, and I couldn't wait for him to be born and get here because I couldn't wait to photograph him on this cool rug. And it makes really great patterns with the repeating lines and the stripes, of course. And then I broke the pattern by having him in the scene, and of course with his bright orange diaper. That adds a lot of fun contrast, which we'll be talking about coming up as well. So a lot of times when you're composing your images, very rarely are you going to have just one of these principles in play. Most of the time you're going to be having multiple principles all being used at the same time. So that was repetition. Next up is what we call leading lines. So leading lines help guide your viewer's eye through your image, moves it along. Here's an example of my husband on a bike, and we are using the road. I'm using the road as a leading line. That's a very common thing that you would see in a photo like this. Roads make great leading lines. Footprints and walking paths make great leading lines. Those are both pretty literal leading lines. Here's an example of a more abstract. So I have a triangle here between these guys flying this little airplane. It's a remote control airplane, and then there's a kayak or something in the bottom right corner. And those three items together form a triangle, and it sort of just keeps the viewer's eyes looping around this shape. And I shot that on my phone, which I often keep in the square format because I'm always on Instagram. So I always have it ready shooting squares. And so here we have a triangle in a square, and I think that adds a lot of interest. Another principle you can use to improve your composition is contrast. So contrast is the difference between things, and it could be difference between colors. So here we have this gold colored Buddha sculpture, and then behind him is this blue wall, so blue and yellow / gold contrast. So I think that's very appealing. And there's a touch of red in the upper right corner. I'm not sure what that was, something else nearby, but it adds some interest. Here is another photo shot with my phone. There's the rug again in my son's room. And I love the contrast in this because we have the contrast of the stripes themselves. We have the contrast with his bedding and the blankets and everything. But we also have the contrast of lines and the direction that the stripes are running, and then we have that diagonal line of his crib. So that's actually the wooden edge of his crib, and it's this 90-degree perpendicular intersection. And I love how the geometry works out there. So you can contrast all kinds of things: color, objects, direction, line, size, even shapes. If you want to learn more about colors and the whole color theory of how that all works, there's a really great tool from Adobe at color.adobe.com. And you can create color schemes and play with color and just really get to know how that works better. I'm really drawn to color, so I use it in my images a lot. Here's another example from London, I think I shot this. And again, with my cell phone, I was just really drawn to the color in the scene. The dramatic blue sky, the red ornamental object there, lantern that's hanging, and then just the nighttime light of the buildings. Here's an image I did for clients. It was an engagement session. And we have the contrast of their black and white clothing and the red balloons. So I kept the background for that photo very neutral. It's just a gray wall, basically. And I think that really makes those balloons pop. Sometimes a photo that looks kind of blah when you are looking at it, the scene here, this is the one of the London airports, and I was drawn to it because the lines in the ceiling, and then when I shot it, I was like, oh, this is kind of just boring, nothing really too exciting about it. But then when I converted it to black and white, those lines became much more pronounced, and then it was a much stronger compositional element. So you may find that actually removing the color can sometimes improve the image. Here's another example. This is a subway stop in the DC area. We see leading lines, so the curve of that ceiling structure leading down to the train, and also the leading line of the escalator on the left. The repeating patterns in the ceiling, I don't know, I would call that like a ceiling tile, but it's not tile. But that sort of rectangular cell pattern in the ceiling is a repeating element. And of course, we have really high contrast between the silhouettes and the bright areas. Here's another example of a black and white street scene. And this was shot after some rain, so the streets are nice and wet, which adds a really great reflective element. Black and white can also increase texture in an image, which is really a function of contrast. So even though the color is gone, we still have a lot of contrast in this image. That's my cat on the staircase of our old house, and it's lit from direct sun from a skylight coming from above, and then it really brings out the texture in her fur. And I don't know that it looked quite so textured in the color version. When you're working in Lightroom, you can actually cook up your own black and white conversions. So you have a lot of power to really fine-tune your black and whites. These are it's the same image and two different settings for black and white in Lightroom. So you can really adjust and tweak with it, play with it to get exactly the conversion you want. It's not that you're just desaturating the image, which would mean to just sort of suck the color out of it. It's not just a desaturation. You can actually go in and adjust how did the reds look when they're black and white? How did the greens look? The yellows, the blues? Each individual color you can really adjust and have total control over. So it's pretty awesome. All right, another basic principle is negative space and balance. This is one of my favorites. So the idea is that you leave just empty space in your frame. So when I'm shooting with my DSLR, it's a nice big rectangle, and I like to leave like half of it empty a lot of times. So in this image here, I'm still following the rule of thirds. So I have this little gal. She was the flower girl in a wedding I was shooting, and she's getting all ready to walk down the aisle. And I shot this through an open doorway, and I just left the whole left side of that frame just dark. That was just the door and the wall, and I love it. And it also communicates sort of a hidden moment. You know, they're clearly not posing for the camera, so I really like that a lot. Here's another example with more negative space. So my subjects are there on the left and just a bunch of open space to the right. Another vertical example. So wedding rings in the bottom third and empty space above. They are centered in the bottom third, but they're centered, but it's still the bottom third, not the center of the frame. Here we have a macro shot of a flower on the left. The right-hand side is again empty. Another cell phone grab, taking my son for a walk. The leading line of the sidewalk, the contrast of the silhouette and the sidewalk and the color of the grass, and then just that empty upper right corner. Another cell phone grab at the playground. Sometimes the things that you leave out in a photo can also just be as compelling as what you put in it. So in this photo, it's just the top of his little hat. another bridal portrait. This is also utilizing another a technique that we'll talk about, frame in a frame. And again, more open space on the left. Now, if you're really thinking through this, you might think, okay, Khara, you told me to fill the frame, so I get it, but now you're telling me to leave empty negative space, which isn't that a paradox? I mean, how can I fill the frame but also have negative space? To which I would say, you are really paying attention, so good job. That's a very, very good question. Yeah, it does sound like a bit of a paradox. And the thing is that when you're filling the frame with negative space, in some cases, you are doing it very carefully. You're not filling it with anything that happens to be around. You're choosing. Remember, composition is all about choice. So for example, here are those tulips again. So the frame is full of a lot of unnecessary stuff. I can see a chain link fence in the top left corner, some random weeds or other random plants in the back. We have some just dirt in the bottom right corner and some daffodils. I mean, it's just kind of a random mess of stuff. So the frame is filled, but not very intentionally. It's not very well curated. So here would be one of those same tulips captured, still filling the frame, but I'm controlling what I'm filling it with. And I'm filling it with sort of nothing, so it's just green, sort of plain background. It's empty but full. So if you can wrap your mind around that, that's what we're talking about. We're filling the frame, but sometimes that means filling it with emptiness. And that emptiness still has weight. So it's also about balance. And we'll see that as we keep moving through all of these. But you're still balancing your subject against an emptiness, an empty area of the frame, but that emptiness still has some weight. So the more that you play with this, you'll get a feel for what creates a good balance. And it just takes practice. So don't be afraid to get out there and really give it a try.